The static crackled first, a hiss of dying radio waves that was more final than any spoken word. In the sterile chill of the Tactical Operations Center, the sound was an epitaph. Colonel Marcus Thorne slammed a fist on the lacquered wood of the command table, not hard enough to betray his rage, but with a contained violence that made the junior officers flinch. The large central screen showed a topographical map of the Zahir Badlands, a knot of canyons and ridges nicknamed the Serpent's Maw. A single friendly icon, Hunter 1, blinked in a deep ravine, its color having shifted from operational green to a desperate, critical red. Air Command just grounded the entire wing, Thorne announced, his voice a low grind of gravel and fury. That Haboob is moving faster than projected. They're calling it a zero visibility, zero survivability event. No assets in the air. Period. The room was thick with the suffocating weight of failure. 6 men, the best operators the Navy had, were trapped. Their last coherent transmission spoke of being pinned by a numerically superior force, their exfil route cut off, and their ammunition running critically low. Now only static. So that's it. Lieutenant Commander Riggs, the SEAL liaison, asked, his face pale under the blue light of the monitors. We just listen to the silence until it's permanent? Thorne's jaw was a knot of granite. We are exploring every option, Commander. But his tone said there were no options left. The storm was a wall of sand and wind moving at 80 knots. A churning monster that would blind sensors, choke engines, and tear aircraft apart. It was an act of God, and God was not on their side. In the back of the room, leaning against a server rack, Major Evelyn Reed said nothing. She was a ghost at the feast, a pilot without a squadron, assigned to this outpost on a liaison tour that felt more like a sentence. Her flight suit was immaculate, her posture ramrod straight, but she existed in the periphery of the command structure, an asset they didn't know how to use. She had watched the briefing, her gaze fixed on the storm's velocity and the canyon's tortuous geography. She wasn't looking at the problem the way they were, as an impassable barrier. She was looking at it as a corridor. Her eyes, a cool and startling gray, traced a path on the screen that didn't officially exist. A seam in the world visible only to someone who understood the violent marriage of air and earth. She listened as they cycled through the impossibilities. Satellite imagery was useless, drone feeds were gone, and the rescue helos couldn't even lift off, let alone navigate the maw in a sandstorm. The consensus was a grim, unspoken verdict. Hunter 1 was lost. The mission was over. Finally, she pushed off the wall. Her boots made no sound on the polished concrete floor as she moved to the edge of the command table. She didn't look at Thorne but at the map. There is a window, she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the murmurs of defeat like a diamond blade. Thorne turned, his expression a mixture of irritation and surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was even in the room. He saw a woman of about 35, her face framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, regulation bun. There were no theatrics in her stance, just an unnerving stillness. A window? Major, in case you missed it, Air Command, Navcent, and God himself have declared this theater closed for business. Several officers snickered. Reed didn't react. Her focus remained on the screen. Not for the F-12, she stated simply. The snickering stopped. The F-12 Wraith was a myth, a piece of black-budget vaporware. Most of the personnel at Al Dafra had only ever seen the single prototype sitting under a tarp in Hangar 7, a place most were forbidden to enter. It was a sleek, angular beast, more wing than fuselage, designed for deep penetration and low-altitude reconnaissance in denied airspace. It was also officially not operational. It was Reed's plane. She had been one of its primary test pilots, the one who had pushed it to the bleeding edge of its capabilities and beyond. That was before the incident, before the inquiry, before she was grounded from combat sorties and shuffled off to this forgotten corner of the world. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He knew who she was. Major Evelyn Echo Reed. A name that was once spoken with a kind of reverence in the test pilot community. A lineage of aviators, her father had been a legend in his own right, flying experimental craft in the Cold War. But Thorne dealt in current realities, not history. The Wraith is a non-certified experimental airframe, Major. It has no combat clearance. It's a ghost on the books. And you are not cleared for combat flight operations. Your request is not just denied. It is out of the question. He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Reed stood there for a moment, the collective gaze of the room on her. They saw a sidelined officer making an absurd, desperate suggestion. They saw a woman who didn't know her place. She met no one's eyes. With the same quiet resolve she had shown stepping forward, she turned and walked out of the TOC. The heavy door hissed shut behind her, leaving Thorne and his staff to preside over the inevitable. But Evelyn Reed wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact. There was a window, and she was going to fly through it. The desert air outside was a blast furnace, thick with the taste of ozone and the approaching storm. The wind was already beginning to howl, a low moan that promised violence. She walked with purpose, her path not toward the officers' quarters, but toward the lonely silhouette of Hangar 7. The conversation might be over in the TOC, but it was just beginning in the sky. She knew the canyon, she knew the storm, and she knew the machine. That was all the clearance she needed. The fate of Hunter 1 was not a matter of regulation. It was a matter of physics, skill, and will. And in those domains she was without peer. The static from the radio was a countdown, and she intended to beat the clock. The dismissal in the TOC had been as predictable as it was absolute. Thorne was a creature of the system, a man who saw the world through the rigid lens of regulations and chain of command. To him, Reed was a problem to be managed, a broken component in the grand military machine. Her suggestion was not a solution. It was an act of insubordination waiting to happen. He had looked right through her, his gaze sweeping past her as if she were part of the furniture, his voice laced with the condescending authority of a man who had already made up his mind. "Major, your input is noted," he'd said, the words a thin veneer over the blunt finality of his decision. "Now, if you'll excuse us, the adults have work to do." The insult was meant to sting, to put her back in her place. But Reed's place was not in that room. Her place was 1,000 feet off the deck, with the world blurring past at Mach 1. She felt no sting, only a cold, clarifying certainty. They were wrong. They were letting 6 men die because of a failure of imagination. She left the oppressive quiet of the command center and stepped into the rising wind. The sky to the east was a bruised purple, the leading edge of the haboob a terrifying, churning wall of dust and sand that was swallowing the horizon. The air was electric. Any other pilot would see it as a death sentence. Reed saw it as cover. She strode across the tarmac, the wind whipping at her flight suit, her destination the one place on base that felt like home. Hangar 7. Inside, the cavernous space was an oasis of calm. The roar of the wind was muffled to a distant sigh. And there, sitting in the center of the polished concrete floor, was the F-12 Wraith. It wasn't beautiful in the classical sense of a fighter jet. It was brutalist art, all sharp angles and flat, radar-absorbent surfaces. Its delta-wing design and twin, canted vertical stabilizers gave it an alien, predatory look. It seemed less built and more grown, a shark designed for moving through the densest, most dangerous waters. Sergeant Leo Vance was waiting for her, a rag in his hand, polishing an already immaculate canopy. He was young, barely 25, with a mechanic's quiet competence and an old soul's eyes. He was the Wraith's crew chief, assigned to the non-operational project as a form of bureaucratic exile himself. He and Reed shared a bond forged in silence and mutual respect for the machine they both served. He didn't ask where she had been or what had been said. He just saw the look on her face. "Storm's coming up fast, Major," he said, his voice low. "Heard it's grounding everyone." "Not everyone," Reed replied, her voice calm as she began her walk around. Her hands moved with an intimate, practiced grace, tracing the seams of the composite skin, checking the intakes, running a gloved finger along the leading edge of the wing. This was her ritual, a silent conversation with the aircraft. Vance watched her, then nodded slowly. "She's ready." Fueled her up and ran the pre-flight diagnostics an hour ago. just a feeling he knew her. He knew she wouldn't let those men die without a fight. Reed paused at the nose gear. Tucked inside the bay door, almost invisible, was a small hand-painted emblem. A single, stylized raven in mid-flight, its wings swept back. It was her father's insignia from his time flying the unacknowledged F-12 Oxcart. He flew missions that were never logged, over places that were never acknowledged. He taught her that some rules were written in ink, but the important ones were written in the sky. She ran her thumb over the cool metal of the painted bird. It was a promise, a legacy. "Colonel Thorne has forbidden any flights," she said, her back to Vance. It wasn't a question or a statement of defeat. It was a simple declaration of fact, for the record. Vance finished wiping the canopy and tossed the rag onto his workbench. He walked over to the hangar's main power console. "Yeah, well, the comms in this hangar have been acting up all day. And this wind is probably going to cause a power surge that trips the main door controls. Might even knock out the security cameras for a few minutes. Damn unreliable infrastructure out here." He looked at her, his expression perfectly neutral. "I'll be logging a maintenance issue. Might take me a while to write it up." It was the only permission she needed. Reed swung herself up the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The ejection seat embraced her like an old friend. The cockpit was Spartan, functional, a symphony of dark screens and glowing buttons. She strapped herself in, the clicks of the buckles echoing in the quiet hangar. Her hands moved over the controls with an economy of motion, flicking switches, priming systems. She taped a small, worn photograph to the side of the canopy frame, a picture of her and her father standing in front of a black, needle-nosed jet from a bygone era. His arm was around her, his smile confident and knowing. She powered on the main displays. The screens flickered to life, bathing her face in a soft green glow. The head-up display, or HUD, materialized as a ghostly projection on the armored glass in front of her. Altitude, airspeed, heading, the language she understood best. With a final, decisive move, she closed the canopy. The hiss of the seal shutting was a world being locked out, and another being embraced. Through the glass, she saw Vance give her a slow, deliberate salute. He then turned and walked toward the power console, his back to the massive hangar doors, which were already beginning to groan and slide open, revealing the raging, sand-choked chaos outside. The Wraith's twin engines spooled up with a low, hungry whine, a sound that promised to tear a hole in the sky. Reed was no longer a sidelined major. She was Echo, and she was going hunting. The transition from the hangar's sterile calm to the storm's fury was instantaneous and violent. One moment, the F-12 Wraith was a caged animal. The next, it was unleashed. As the jet rolled onto the taxiway, the wind hit it like a physical blow, a solid wall of air and sand that rocked the 20-ton machine. Inside the cockpit, Reed was an island of tranquility in the heart of the maelstrom. Her world had shrunk to the glowing symbology of the HUD and the tactile feedback of the flight stick in her right hand. The outside world was a blur of brown and gray, a churning chaos that would have induced vertigo in a lesser pilot. Thorne's voice, tinny and laced with disbelief and rage, crackled in her helmet. "Major Reed, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You are in violation of a direct order. Return to the hangar immediately." "That is an order." Reed's thumb moved to the comms panel and switched to a secondary, encrypted channel. She didn't have time for him. Her focus was absolute. Lining up on the runway was a formality. The wind was a brutal crosswind, and the runway itself was barely visible. She wasn't taking off. She was launching. With a final check of her engine temperatures and control surfaces, she pushed the throttles forward to their military power detent. The twin engines roared, straining against the brakes. The entire airframe shuddered with contained power. Then she released the brakes and engaged the afterburners. The world dissolved into a concussive blast of sound and force. The Wraith didn't accelerate down the runway so much as it exploded from a standstill. It leaped forward, the acceleration pinning Reed deep into her seat. The sandstorm, which had seemed so menacing, was now just a texture, a medium she was passing through. She rotated, lifting the nose, and the jet climbed into the sky not with grace, but with an earth-shattering violence. For a few seconds, she was blind, climbing through the densest part of the storm, relying solely on her instruments. The airframe groaned as turbulence hammered it from all sides. Alarms shrieked, proximity, wind shear, engine intake pressure. She calmly silenced them one by one, her hands a blur on the controls, making 1,000 micro-adjustments per second. This was where the Wraith and Reed excelled. The jet was designed with an advanced terrain-following radar system, a set of forward-looking sensors that could paint a wireframe model of the world onto her HUD even in zero visibility. It was a system so sensitive and so demanding that most pilots found it overwhelming. To Reed, it was as natural as breathing. She leveled off at just 300 feet, a suicidally low altitude for these conditions. The ground, invisible to the naked eye, was a shimmering green grid on her display. She was flying blind, yet she could see everything. "Echo is airborne," she said, her voice even, broadcasting on the channel she knew the SEALs would be monitoring. "En route to your position. It is 7 minutes, in the dark ravine of the Serpent's Maw." The transmission was a miracle. Hunter One's leader, Lieutenant Mason Aries Cole, was pressed behind a rock outcropping, the snap and crack of incoming rounds echoing off the canyon walls. His comms officer, a young specialist named Diaz, looked at him with wide, incredulous eyes. "Sir, did you hear that?" "I heard it," Cole grunted, firing a short, controlled burst from his rifle. "Probably a ghost signal. The storm is playing tricks," but the voice had been too clear, too calm. It was a sliver of impossible hope. Reed banked the Wraith hard, pushing it toward the coordinates she had memorized from the TOC. The entrance to the Serpent's Maw was a narrow slit in a sheer cliff face, a geological nightmare. In clear weather, it was a challenge. In a sandstorm, it was a tomb. She approached the canyon system not head-on, but from the side, flying parallel to the massive rock face. The terrain-following radar showed her the opening, a dark void in the green grid. To enter, she would have to execute a knife-edge turn, rolling the jet 90 degrees onto its side and threading it through a gap barely wider than her wingspan. It was a maneuver that existed only in simulations and the wildest dreams of airshow pilots. Reed's breathing remained steady. She disengaged the flight control system's limiters, taking direct, raw control of the aircraft. "Here we go," she whispered to the photograph of her father. She rolled the Wraith onto its left wing, the ground now a vertical wall on her HUD. The G-forces crushed her into her seat as she pulled the stick back, carving a perfect, impossible arc. The tip of her right wing skimmed the cliff face, sending a shower of sparks and sandstone dust into the storm. For a breathtaking second, the jet was a silver needle threading a stone eye. Then she was through. She was in the canyon. The air inside the maw was marginally clearer, the towering rock walls providing some shelter from the main force of the storm, but it was a swirling vortex of sand and violent, unpredictable updrafts. The canyon floor was 1,000 feet below, a ribbon of darkness. She was flying inside the earth itself. The rage in Colonel Thorne's voice had been replaced by a stunned silence. In the TOC, they had watched her transponder icon perform a maneuver that their systems flagged as a crash. The icon had disappeared for a moment, then reappeared inside the canyon's boundaries. No one spoke. They just stared at the screen, at the ghost that had just flown through a solid wall of rock. Reed was now in the deadliest environment imaginable. The enemy knew the storm had grounded all air support. They would never expect a threat from above. That was her advantage. She pushed the throttles forward, accelerating deeper into the Serpent's Maw. The hunt had begun. The sound of her engines, contained by the canyon walls, was the roar of an avenging angel. The moment the F-12 Wraith breached the canyon walls, the acoustic landscape changed. The diffuse roar of the open storm was replaced by a sharp, focused thunder that ricocheted between the towering sandstone cliffs. The sound wave preceded the aircraft, a harbinger of its arrival. Down on the canyon floor, the men of Hunter One heard it first. It wasn't the familiar high-pitched whine of a standard fighter jet. This was a deep, guttural roar, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "What the hell is that?" Diaz yelled over the relentless gunfire. Lieutenant Cole risked a glance upward, into the swirling brown chaos. He saw nothing but sand and rock. But the sound was getting closer, moving impossibly fast. The enemy fighters, dug into the rocks above them, heard it too. They paused their assault, their confusion a momentary gift. For the first time in an hour, the volume of incoming fire lessened. Hunter 1 used the lull to reload and redistribute their dwindling ammunition. "All stations, this is Echo." Reed's voice cut through their comms again, impossibly clear. "I am overhead. Mark your position with IR strobe." On my command, Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't a ghost signal. "Hunter 1 copies Echo," he replied, his own voice tight with a hope he hadn't dared to feel. "We're pinned in the gorge at grid 34 Delta. Hostiles are on the north and east ridges, elevated positions. Heavy machine gun at the head of the canyon has us boxed in." Reed's eyes scanned her panoramic display, which cross-referenced the terrain-following radar with thermal imaging. The storm made it difficult, but the heat signatures of active weapons and running engines began to bloom on her screen like pale flowers. The canyon was crawling with them. "I see them," she said. Her tone was as clinical as a surgeon assessing a patient. "The heavy gun first. Ares, mark it, can't. Echo. We're suppressed. No line of sight. Don't need it," Reed replied. She had already isolated its thermal signature, a bright, angry star at the far end of the ravine. It was tucked into a cave, a smart position that protected it from traditional air attack. But her approach was anything but traditional. She pulled the Wraith into a steep, climbing turn, hugging the canyon wall so tightly that her wingtip vortices churned the sand clinging to the rock. The enemy on the ridges saw a fleeting, dark shape moving with impossible speed and opened fire. Tracer rounds, green and red, stitched across the space where she had been a second before. She ignored them. Her target was the machine gun nest. She rolled the jet inverted, hanging upside down from her straps, the canyon floor now her sky. The maneuver put immense strain on the airframe and her body, but it gave her the perfect angle of attack. On her HUD, a targeting reticle locked onto the heat signature in the cave. A calm, female voice from the jet's computer announced, "Target locked." Reed squeezed the trigger on her control stick. There was no massive explosion. The F-12 carried a specialized munition, the SDBX, a small-diameter bomb designed for surgical strikes with minimal collateral damage. A single dark shape detached from the Wraith's underbelly. It didn't fall. It flew, guided by its own fins, straight into the mouth of the cave. The impact was a dull thud, followed by a bright flash deep within the rock. The angry chatter of the heavy machine gun ceased instantly. A plume of black smoke billowed out of the cave entrance, quickly shredded by the wind. On the canyon floor, the change was immediate and profound. The constant, terrifying thud-thud-thud that had kept them pinned for an hour was gone. Cole and his men could move. They could breathe. "Target neutralized," Reed's voice announced, as calmly as if she were reporting the time. "Hunter 1, you are clear to advance." Cole stared at the now-silent cave. He hadn't even seen the aircraft, just a flicker of shadow against the storm. It was like an act of God. "Jesus Christ," Diaz whispered, his eyes wide. In the TOC, the mood had shifted from furious disbelief to rapt attention. The officers who had snickered at Reed were now leaning forward, their faces illuminated by the screens. They watched the thermal feed from a high-altitude drone that had managed to find a temporary hole in the storm cover. They saw the hostile icons on the ridges blink out, one by one. Thorne stood behind the main console, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He watched the icon labeled Echo move through the canyon on the map, a predator systematically dismantling a web. It wasn't just flying, it was a form of violent geometry. Every turn, every pass was precise, economical, and lethally effective. After the first strike, Reed didn't let up. She made another pass, this time flying straight down the center of the canyon, so low that the SEALs felt the ground shake. She wasn't using bombs now. She opened up with the Wraith's 25mm cannon. The weapon's roar was a terrifying, deep-throated growl, completely different from the high-pitched brrrt of an A-10. Each round was an explosive shell that detonated on impact, turning enemy fighting positions into clouds of shattered rock and dust. Her first pass flipped the tide of the battle. The hunters had become the hunted. The overwhelming enemy force was now broken, confused, and being torn apart from an angle they never thought possible. They were trapped in the canyon with a ghost, and the ghost was angry. The balance of power had not just shifted. It had been shattered. One pilot in one impossible aircraft had done in 90 seconds what an entire squadron could not. The legend of Echo, once a fading memory in the test pilot community, was being rewritten in fire and smoke in the heart of the Serpent's Maw. With the immediate threat of the heavy machine gun eliminated, the enemy's coordinated assault fractured into panicked, desperate pockets of resistance. They were trained fighters, not conscripts, and they adapted quickly. They knew they were being hunted by a single, low-flying aircraft. The sky was no longer a safe haven for their unseen adversary. It was a trap. From concealed positions along the canyon's upper ledges, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles began to appear. The first one launched with a puff of smoke and a streak of fire, a serpent of heat and explosive energy screaming through the turbulent air toward the Wraith. Missile launch! Missile launch! 9 o'clock high! The Wraith's automated threat warning system blared in Reed's helmet, its synthetic voice sharp with urgency. On her HUD, a diamond symbol appeared, tracking the incoming manpads. Reed's response was instantaneous, almost instinctive. She yanked the stick hard to the right, pulling the jet into a gut-wrenching, high-G turn that pressed her deep into her seat. At the same time, her thumb jabbed a button on the throttle, releasing a cloud of incandescent flares. The missile, confused by the sudden appearance of multiple, hotter targets, veered off and detonated harmlessly against the canyon wall. The explosion a dull boom that was swallowed by the storm. But it was just the first. Another launch warning screamed. Then another. The enemy was trying to saturate the airspace, to bracket her between multiple threats. They were using the canyon's tight confines to their advantage, limiting her room to maneuver. Echo, you have multiple launches. Cole's voice crackled over the net, a new tension in his tone. From the ground, he could see the smoke trails arcing through the sky. They're trying to box you in. I see them, Reed replied, her breathing controlled, her voice betraying no hint of the immense pressure she was under. She was flying on a razor's edge, dodging missiles while simultaneously keeping track of friendly and hostile positions on the ground. It was a three-dimensional chess game at the speed of sound. In the TOC, the atmosphere was electric. Thorne had moved to the primary communications console, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. He had taken off his command headset and was now listening to the raw, unfiltered comms chatter from the canyon. The initial anger he'd felt had been burned away, replaced by a cold, professional focus. He was no longer a commander trying to discipline a rogue pilot. He was a tactician watching a master at work. Get me a direct link to her, Thorne ordered a comms tech. Scramble a channel. Just me and her. The tech's fingers flew across the keyboard. Channel is open, sir. She'll have to accept. A new light blinked on Reed's console. A priority communication request from command. She spared it a half-second glance. She was too busy. Another missile was closing in, this one from her 6 o'clock. She couldn't outrun it in the tight canyon. Instead, she chopped the throttle and popped her air brakes. The Wraith decelerated violently, the missile overshooting her by mere feet before she slammed the throttles back into afterburner and shot away. The maneuver was brutal on the airframe, but effective. Thorne watched her icon on the tactical display, saw the impossible physics of her movements. He saw the missile icons bloom and then disappear. She's not accepting the link, sir, the tech said, his voice quiet. Thorne nodded, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his eyes. Keep the channel open. Feed her all the intel we have. I want every sensor we can muster pointed at that canyon. Drone feeds, satellite thermal signals intelligence. Anything that gives her a better picture. Give her eyes the entire focus of the multimillion-dollar command center, which hours before had dismissed her, was now singularly dedicated to supporting her. The institutional doubt had evaporated under the heat of her actions. Skepticism had given way to a desperate, burgeoning trust. Reed, oblivious to the shift in the TOC, was fully immersed in the battle. The enemy was smart. They were firing from the shadows of overhangs, using the rock itself to mask their heat signatures until the last possible second. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. She needed to change the rules. Instead of just reacting, she went on the offensive. On her next pass, she didn't fly down the center of the canyon. She dropped the Wraith to an altitude that was not just low, but insane. She flew below the level of the ridges where the missile teams were hiding. The ground rushed past her canopy in a terrifying, hypnotic blur. Her terrain-following radar was screaming, painting the HUD with urgent proximity warnings. From her new vantage point, looking up, she could see them. The thermal blooms of the missile teams stood out clearly against the colder rock of the canyon walls. She had flipped the script. They were exposed. "Hunter 1, I'm going to clean the ridges," she transmitted, her voice steady. "Stay down." She armed her cannon again. Rolling the jet onto its side, she flew a strafing run along the length of the northern ridge, her cannon spitting explosive shells upwards into the enemy positions. The effect was devastating. Rock, shrapnel, and bodies were blasted from the ledges. She repeated the maneuver on the eastern ridge, a dark angel scything through the ranks of the enemy. The missile launches stopped. The escalation had been met and crushed. Reed had taken their adaptation, their smartest tactic, and turned it into a fatal weakness. The canyon fell quiet again. The only sounds the howl of the wind and the distant, fading roar of the Wraith's engines as she prepared for her next move. The balance had shifted once more, not just in firepower, but in tactical dominance. She wasn't just surviving their trap. She was dismantling it piece by piece. Thorne listened to the silence, his expression grimly satisfied. He had sent 6 of his best men into a meat grinder. A woman he had written off as a relic was now their only way out. The enemy was broken but not yet defeated. The immediate threats on the ridges were gone, but fighters were still scattered throughout the canyon's complex network of gullies and caves. They were now a scattered, desperate force, which in some ways made them more dangerous. Hunter 1 was still deep inside hostile territory, their extraction still a distant hope. Reed knew that suppressing the enemy was only half the battle. She had to get them out. The rescue helicopter, a Pave Hawk callsign Guardian 1, was still grounded back at the base, its crew listening helplessly to the battle unfolding in the maw. The storm was the problem. But for Reed, the storm was also the solution. "Guardian 1, this is Echo," she transmitted on the command frequency, knowing Thorne was listening. "What's your minimum visibility and wind tolerance for a hover extraction?" The pilot's voice came back, strained. "Minimums are out the window, Echo. Command has us on a hard down. We can't get in there." "I'm not asking Command," Reed said, her voice sharp. "I'm asking you. If I can create a pocket of calm air and give you a clear line of sight to the LZ, can you make the pickup?" There was a pause. The Pave Hawk pilot was consulting with his co-pilot. "Theoretically, if the air was stable and we had a visual, maybe. But Echo, that's impossible. The wind shear in that canyon will tear a helicopter apart." "Stand by," Reed said. It was a promise. She had a plan, a maneuver so audacious and so dangerous it had only ever been performed in a simulator, and even then, it had failed more often than it succeeded. It was a concept from her father's era, a theoretical application of jet wash and aerodynamics called a dynamic air shield. She flew to the head of the canyon, a wider basin where Cole had indicated a possible landing zone. Then, she did something that defied all logic of aerial combat. She slowed the Wraith down, dropping its speed until it was just above its stall threshold, a precarious balancing act. She was a nearly stationary target. Then she pointed the nose of the jet up at a steep, 45-degree angle and pushed the throttles into full afterburner. The Wraith, with its incredible thrust-to-weight ratio, didn't just climb. It hung in the air, held aloft by the sheer, raw power of its engines. The twin afterburners ignited the sand-filled air, creating two brilliant blue blowtorches that roared against the storm. The directed thrust, a hurricane of superheated gas, acted like a massive atmospheric plow. It blasted a channel through the swirling sand and turbulence, creating a temporary, localized zone of relative calm in its wake. It was an act of pure brute force, bending the weather to her will. "Guardian 1, she said. Her voice strained from the effort of holding the jet in its unnatural high-alpha state. "Your window is open. You have a 90-second hole. Go now." In the TOC, they watched on the thermal imagery as a pocket of clear, stable air formed in the middle of the raging storm. It was a miracle of physics. Thorne grabbed the microphone. "Guardian 1, you heard her. Go, go, go." The Pave Hawk lifted off, its rotors clawing at the air. It flew directly towards the beacon Reed had created, a pillar of fire in the heart of the storm. From the ground, Cole and his men watched in awe as the sky above them literally parted. The swirling brown chaos was blasted away, revealing a patch of dark, angry sky. The roar of the Wraith's engines was a physical presence, a deafening wall of sound. Then, through the hole in the storm, they saw it. The descending silhouette of the Pave Hawk, its rescue hoist already lowering. But holding the position was taking a colossal toll on the Wraith. Alarms were screaming: engine temperature, fuel consumption, aerodynamic stress. Reed was burning through her fuel at an alarming rate, and the airframe was shuddering under the strain. Worse, the remaining enemy fighters saw their chance. The hovering jet was the easiest target they'd had all day. RPGs and machine gun fire began arcing up towards her. "Echo, you're drawing fire." "Heavy fire from the west wall," Cole yelled. Reed couldn't maneuver without collapsing the air shield. She was a sitting duck. "Just get your men on the bird, Ares," she grunted, the G-forces and concentration making her words clipped. She toggled her countermeasures, firing off flares and chaff, but she couldn't dodge. A volley of heavy machine gun rounds raked across her left wing, the impacts sounding like hammers against the fuselage. A warning light flashed. Hydraulic pressure loss. She was bleeding, but she held her position, a defiant statue of fire and steel in the sky. She would not move, not until Hunter 1 was safe. The 90 seconds felt like an eternity. On the ground, the SEALs were being winched up, one by one, providing their own covering fire. The Pave Hawk was a stable rock in the bubble Reed had created. It was the single most daring and brilliantly executed piece of close air support any of them had ever witnessed. It was her signature move, not a dogfighting trick, but an act of pure, selfless protection. The last man of Hunter 1, Lieutenant Cole, was clipped onto the hoist. As he was lifted from the canyon floor, he never took his eyes off the F-12 Wraith. It hung in the sky above him, a dark cross bleeding fire, absorbing the enemy's desperate, final volleys. He could see the impacts sparking across its wings, chunks of its composite skin being torn away. It was a sight he would never forget. The aircraft was dying so they could live. "We're clear. All personnel on board," the Pave Hawk's crew chief shouted. "Guardian 1 is away." The helicopter banked sharply, pulling out of the protective bubble and climbing through the hole in the storm Reed had carved for them. The moment the Pave Hawk was clear, Reed chopped her throttles. The afterburners snuffed out, and the roar that had filled the canyon was replaced by the howl of the wind. The Wraith, its lift gone, fell from the sky like a stone. For a terrifying moment, it looked like it was going to crash. Warning lights flashed across her entire console. The hydraulic failure was critical. Her controls were sluggish, almost unresponsive. The jet was barely flying. But she wasn't done yet. As the aircraft fell, she used its momentum to dive towards the last known enemy positions. She was a wounded predator making one final, vengeful strike. With her remaining control authority, she lined up a strafing run. Her cannon, miraculously undamaged, spoke one last time. She raked the western wall where the heaviest fire had originated, silencing it for good. Her message was clear. The Serpent's maw belonged to her. Now she had to save herself. The exit of the canyon was miles away, and she was losing altitude fast. The jet responded to her inputs with a sickening delay. Every movement was a fight. "Echo, what's your status?" Thorne's voice demanded over the private channel. This time she answered. "Multiple system failures. Major hydraulic loss. Flight controls are compromised," she reported. Her voice tight with exertion but still devoid of panic. "I'm not sure I can make it back to base." The TOC fell silent. They had watched her perform miracles, and now they were listening to her fight for her own life. "Give me your vector," Thorne said. "I'll have the crash crews and emergency services on standby." "Negative," Reed said. "Don't clutter the runway. If I can't hold her, I'm putting her down in the desert." She was still thinking of others, of keeping the main runway clear for other operations. The flight back was a desperate struggle. She coaxed the crippled Wraith through the storm, the jet shuddering and groaning with every gust of wind. The green wireframe of the world on her HUD was her only guide. She flew not with the aggressive precision from before, but with a delicate, gentle touch, trying not to ask too much of the dying machine. She cleared the storm front, and the world outside her canopy returned. The base was a distant smudge of lights on the horizon. She was losing hydraulic fluid too fast. Her landing gear wouldn't deploy. A belly landing was her only option. She transmitted her intentions. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Echo declaring an emergency. "I will be attempting a gear-up landing on runway 3" on the ground. Everything was chaos in motion. Crash trucks, foam tenders, and ambulances screamed towards the runway, their lights flashing in the twilight. Thorne was out of the TOC, standing on the tarmac near the control tower, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He watched the dark, angular shape of the F-12 approach, its silhouette wrong without the gear down. It was coming in fast, too fast. Reed knew it too. Without full control, she had to keep her speed up to maintain stability. She bled off as much as she could, then aimed for the runway's threshold. The landing was not a landing. It was a controlled crash. The Wraith's belly slammed into the asphalt with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. Sparks flew in a 50-foot plume behind the jet as it skidded down the runway, a wounded beast being dragged to its grave. Reed fought the controls the entire way, keeping the jet straight, preventing it from cartwheeling into a fireball. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the F-12 ground to a halt, shrouded in smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Silence. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was no movement. Then the canopy hissed open. Major Evelyn Reed, outlined against the emergency lights, unstrapped herself and climbed slowly, deliberately, out of the cockpit. She had brought her aircraft home. She had covered the extraction. Her duty was done. As the emergency crews swarmed the smoking, mangled wreck of the F-12 Wraith, a cordon of military police formed a perimeter, keeping the growing crowd of onlookers at a distance. Colonel Thorne pushed through the line, his face grim. He strode directly toward the aircraft, his eyes fixed on the figure standing beside it. Reed was on the ground, leaning against the forward fuselage of her crippled jet. She had removed her helmet, and the wind, now just a brisk desert breeze, teased loose strands of her dark hair. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with soot, but she was standing. Her gaze was on the rescue helicopter, Guardian 1, as it settled onto its landing pad a few hundred yards away. The ramp lowered, and 6 figures in combat gear walked out. They were battered, weary, but alive. Thorne stopped a few feet from her. He looked from Reed to the shredded wing of the Wraith, at the deep gouges in the runway, at the returned seals. He took in the entire tableau of impossible success and catastrophic cost. For a long moment he said nothing. The air was filled with the ticking of the cooling engines and the distant shouts of the fire crews. Reed finally turned her head and met his gaze. Her eyes were clear, holding no defiance, no accusation, no plea for validation. They simply held the quiet weight of what she had done. The first to break the silence was not Thorne. Lieutenant Mason Aries Cole, the leader of Hunter 1, broke away from his team and walked with a determined stride across the tarmac. He ignored the debriefing officers trying to intercept him, ignored the MPs, ignored his own exhaustion. He walked straight past Colonel Thorne and stopped directly in front of Reed. He was caked in dust and grime, his gear torn, but he stood tall. He looked at the woman who had pulled his team from the jaws of death, then at the machine she had sacrificed to do it. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a pat on the back. He simply brought his heels together and rendered a sharp, perfect salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, from one warrior to another, an acknowledgement that transcended rank and regulation. The other 5 members of Hunter 1, watching from a distance, followed their leader's example. 6 salutes, held unwavering in the flashing emergency lights. Reed, taken aback for a fraction of a second, returned Cole's salute with a crispness that belied her fatigue. "Thank you, Echo," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. He held the salute for a beat longer, then lowered his hand, nodded once, and turned to rejoin his team. That was it. No grand speeches, no medals, just a simple, profound recognition from the men whose lives she had saved. The name Echo was no longer a half-forgotten call sign from her past. It was now a living legend, spoken with reverence by the most elite warfighters on the planet. Thorne watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He walked over to Reed as the SEALs moved toward the medical tents. He stopped beside her, and together they looked at the ruined F-12. "The inquiry for this will be a nightmare," Thorne said, his voice flat. "Unauthorized flight of an experimental asset, violation of a direct order, destruction of a billion-dollar prototype." Reed stared at the jet. It was a necessary action. Colonel Thorne was silent for a moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a datapad. He tapped the screen a few times, his movements precise. "According to the tower logs and the hangar maintenance report, Major, you never flew today. The F-12 Wraith suffered a catastrophic systems failure during a ground-based diagnostic run, triggered by the storm's electromagnetic interference. It seems Sergeant Vance was lucky to escape before it caught fire." He looked at her. "Your flight clearance for combat operations was reinstated this afternoon. Your new assignment is pending. We need a pilot who can teach our Top Guns how to fly in adverse weather. You start tomorrow." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her aircraft. It was his form of recognition, a silent, bureaucratic reversal, an erasure of her insubordination and a restoration of her status. He was updating her file not with a reprimand, but with a promotion. The system, so rigid and dismissive, was now bending to accommodate her proven, undeniable competence. The legend was now official. The chaos on the runway slowly subsided, replaced by the methodical hum of activity. The fire was out, the foam was being cleared, and a heavy crane was being moved into position to lift the broken carcass of the F-12. The flashing lights were replaced by steady, bright work lamps, casting long shadows in the cool desert night. Major Evelyn Reed remained by her aircraft, a silent sentinel watching over a fallen comrade. She had been cleared by the medics. A few bruises, strained muscles, and ringing ears, but otherwise unharmed. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. She walked the length of the fuselage, her gloved hand running gently over the scored and battered skin. The metal was still warm. She could feel the deep vibrations of the cooling turbines, the last sighs of the machine. It had given her everything it had, and she had asked for even more. The left wing was a mangled ruin, shredded by the machine gun fire. The belly was torn open, exposing a tangle of wires and hydraulic lines. The sleek, predatory beauty was gone, replaced by the brutal reality of its sacrifice. Yet, to her, it had never looked more magnificent. Sergeant Vance appeared out of the shadows, carrying a thermos and 2 mugs. He approached quietly, with the reverence of someone entering a church. He didn't speak, just handed her a steaming mug. The rich, dark smell of coffee cut through the lingering scent of jet fuel and burnt electronics. "I filed the report, Major," he said, his voice low as he leaned against the nose gear. careful not to touch the damaged parts. Power surge from the storm. Fried the primary systems. Total loss. He took a sip from his own mug. They're calling it a miracle no one was hurt. Reed looked at him over the rim of her mug. In his eyes, she saw the same quiet understanding and fierce loyalty he had shown her in the hangar. What felt like a lifetime ago. "Thank you, Leo," she said, using his first name for the first time. He just nodded, his gaze drifting to the silent, waiting Crane. "They'll take her apart. Send the pieces back to the labs. Study her, I guess. They'll learn from her," Reed corrected softly. She did what she was built for. She took a slow sip of the hot coffee, the warmth a welcome anchor in the swirling exhaustion. Her mind replayed the flight, the impossible turn into the canyon, the missile evasion, the strain of holding the air shield. She saw the faces of the SEALs, their salutes cutting through the chaos. She heard Thorne's voice, erasing her transgression from the official record. There would be no parade, no medal ceremony in front of the press. Her victory was written in the quiet respect of the men she saved, in a silently updated personnel file, and in the survival of 6 operators who were supposed to be ghosts. That was more than enough. Her eyes found the nose gear bay. The small, painted raven, her father's emblem, was still there, untouched by the fire and the violence. It was scuffed and grimy, but its wings were still swept back, forever in flight. She reached out and traced its outline with her finger, a final, silent communion. The roar of engines was gone, replaced by the whisper of the desert wind. The dust of the haboob had settled, leaving the air clean and the stars brilliant in the vast, dark sky. Major Evelyn Reed stood in the quiet aftermath, a pilot beside her fallen aircraft, her dignity intact, her legend forged not in words, but in a single impossible flight. The night was silent, but for those who knew what had happened in the Serpent's Maw, the echo of her courage would resonate forever.